Luke Harrison believed in one simple creed: work hard, leave people alone, expect the same in return. For generations, his family had tilled the same stretch of rugged Montana earth, raising cattle, harvesting wheat, and living by the rhythm of the land. The sprawling Harrison Ranch wasn't just a piece of property, it was a breathing testament to a lineage of stubborn, proud survivors who valued independence more than anything else. Each morning, Luke woke up to a world untouched by the chaos of suburban life, golden fields stretching to the horizon, the lowing of cattle as the first rays of sunlight cut through the mist, and the comforting scent of damp earth. It was the kind of life most modern Americans couldn't even comprehend anymore. But Luke? He thrived on it. And then she arrived. Karen Davenport, president of the newly minted Willowbrook HOA, a sprawling cookie-cutter subdivision planted like a cancer along the southern boundary of Luke's land. She was a woman fueled by a need to impose order where none was wanted, and she had appointed herself the guardian of community standards with a zeal that bordered on religious fanaticism. Luke first spotted her one dusty afternoon as he mended a stretch of broken fence. She marched toward his porch like a general approaching enemy lines, beige pantsuit, clipboard clutched tight, high heels stabbing into the dirt with righteous indignation. He knew trouble when he saw it. Karen's smile was tight, her voice clipped as she introduced herself and launched into a speech about visual impacts and property values. Luke listened with the detached bemusement of a man watching a small dog bark at a bull. She wanted the red paint stripped from his century-old barn. She wanted the roosters to stop crowing before dawn. She wanted the unsightly livestock fenced from view. Luke politely told her she had no authority here. His land was sovereign. He owed nothing to Willowbrook's HOA. Her eyes flashed, her mouth tightened, but she left for the moment. Luke watched her SUV kick up dust as it disappeared down the road, knowing in his gut that it wasn't the last he'd see of her. He was right. The next week brought a tidal wave of petty harassment. HOA certified letters demanding compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards. Anonymous complaints to the county about health hazards and code violations. Random HOA board members showing up uninvited, threatening him with zoning fines. Luke laughed it off at first. It was almost funny how little they understood. His property was legally outside their reach, and agricultural zoning protected him like an invisible shield. But Karen was persistent. She wasn't fighting with laws or facts. She was fighting with sheer, suffocating bureaucracy, death by 1,000 paper cuts. Then came the chainsaws. One morning, while inspecting a watering trough, Luke heard it, the whine of chainsaws from the property line. He sprinted over and found hired contractors erecting an ugly, towering privacy fence that sliced into his land. Karen stood proudly overseeing it, her clipboard tucked under one arm, acting like a queen surveying her newly seized territory. When Luke confronted her, she coolly explained they were adjusting the property lines for community harmony based on older survey maps. It took every ounce of self-control not to explode right there. Instead, Luke called the sheriff. The contractors, realizing they'd been duped, packed up and fled. Karen, face red with fury, vowed that the HOA wasn't done yet. She wasn't lying. Within days, Luke found a for-sale future home of Willowbrook expansion sign planted squarely on his land. No warning. No negotiation. Just the brazen audacity to assume they could claim his birthright by force of will. Luke ripped it down with his bare hands. That night, as he sat on his porch staring at the Montana stars, a cold, determined smile spread across his face. If Karen Davenport wanted a war, she was going to get one. The next morning, Luke Harrison stood in the center of his yard, hands on his hips, gazing up at his latest addition to the ranch, a towering bronze church bell, suspended from a heavy timber frame he'd built himself out of rough-hewn logs. It wasn't just any bell. It was the old town bell from a decommissioned church 10 miles away, a 300-pound relic that once called farmers in from the fields and announced Sunday services to a town that no longer existed. Luke had salvaged it years ago, unsure what he would ever do with it. Now, thanks to Karen Davenport's relentless harassment, he finally had a reason. By noon, the bell was fully operational. Luke tested it, grinning with satisfaction as the deep, thunderous clang echoed across the valley, rattling windows all the way into Willowbrook. If Karen thought a few roosters were disruptive, she hadn't heard anything yet. But Luke wasn't done. He spent the next few days planning something bigger, something that would make the HOA's sterile community standards look pathetic in comparison. If they wanted to pretend his farm was an eyesore, he would turn it into the biggest, most joyful, most chaotic celebration they had ever seen. He called it the Montana Harvest Festival. It started with a few calls to friends, ranchers, artisans, musicians. Word spread fast. Within days, volunteers showed up from all over the county, building booths, stringing lights between the trees, setting up hay rides and petting zoos. The festival would be a full-day event. Fresh produce stands overflowing with pumpkins, apples, and corn. Homemade pies and preserves judged in a friendly competition. Live bluegrass music performed on a makeshift stage. Kids' games like sack races, goat cuddling, and lasso contests. And, of course, a ceremonial ringing of the giant bell to kick things off. By the time the first crisp October morning of the festival rolled around, Luke's ranch was transformed into a scene straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting, vibrant, alive, and utterly incompatible with Karen Davenport's vision of acceptable aesthetics. The turnout shattered expectations. Hundreds of cars lined the country roads. Families spilled onto the property, kids shrieking with laughter as they darted between booths. Elderly couples ambled through sunflower rows towering taller than any HOA fence could hope to hide. Teenagers flirted over caramel apples. Musicians stomped and fiddled under the blue Montana sky. And the best part? There was absolutely nothing the HOA could do to stop it. Luke had made sure of that. Every permit had been filed properly with the county. The event was zoned under agricultural tourism laws, statutes so old and ironclad that even the most aggressive HOA lawyer wouldn't dare challenge them. But Karen tried anyway. Around noon, as Luke helped a group of kids learn how to bottle feed a calf, he caught sight of Karen Davenport weaving through the crowd, her heels sinking into the dirt, her face twisted in disbelief. She stormed up to the main booth, cornering Luke just as he was handing out ribbons for the pie contest. "This is an unauthorized gathering," she hissed, barely able to contain her fury. Luke looked at her, deadpan. "Actually, ma'am, this is a fully permitted agricultural fair. Would you like an apple pie?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I'll be reporting this noise violation," she spat. Luke smiled warmly. "Please do. The county sheriff's tent is over by the stage. He's judging the chili cook-off." Indeed, Sheriff Tom Caldwell, Luke's old friend, was currently sampling spicy stews with a huge grin on his face. Karen paled, realizing she was hopelessly outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly outmaneuvered. The best she could manage was a shrill threat about following up with the HOA board, before storming off to her car, peeling away in a spray of gravel. But Luke wasn't even watching her go. He was too busy accepting a homemade apple pie from Grace, one of his earliest allies, a wiry, sun-weathered woman who had once served 2 tours overseas and now lived quietly on the edges of Willowbrook, constantly on the verge of open rebellion against HOA absurdities. "You're officially a legend," Grace said, handing him the pie with a wink. Luke chuckled. "Reckon I'm just getting started." He was right. Because while Karen sulked in her beige fortress plotting her next move, Luke was already planning the next event, a weekly farmer's market. Legally sound. Publicly adored. Logistically impossible for the HOA to stop without exposing themselves as the soulless bureaucrats they truly were. Luke didn't just want to survive Karen's harassment anymore. He wanted to outshine it. To bury it under an avalanche of joy, color, and community spirit so overwhelming that even the most uptight suburbanite couldn't help but be won over. By the end of the festival, Luke's farm wasn't just a property anymore. It was a movement. And as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long gold shadows over fields bursting with laughter and music, Luke stood by the bell tower, hand resting on the thick hemp rope, and gave one final, mighty pull. The bell rang out, deep, triumphant, unstoppable. The sound rolled across Willowbrook like a tsunami, rattling the sterile vinyl siding and shaking the HOA's fragile illusion of control. It was more than a noise. It was a declaration. This land was free, and it always would be. Karen Davenport wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat gracefully. The Harvest Festival had humiliated her, not just because of the sheer scale of it, but because of the laughter. The way even former supporters in Willowbrook had chuckled behind her back as Luke Harrison's ranch bloomed into a symbol of freedom right under her nose. To Karen, it wasn't just about property values anymore. It was about control. Control slipping through her fingers like dry sand. And when people like Karen lose control, they turn desperate. And desperate people become dangerous. The first sign came a few days after the festival. Luke noticed unfamiliar vehicles, nondescript sedans and SUVs, parked near the old cattle trail leading toward Willowbrook. They never pulled into his drive, never approached openly, but their presence was obvious. Engines idling. Windows tinted too dark for Montana's wide-open skies. Luke didn't need to guess. Karen had hired private investigators. At first, he thought about ignoring them. Let them waste their money. Let them take pictures of cows and hay bales all day long if it made them feel powerful. But then, he caught one of the men crouched near his fence line with a telephoto lens, snapping pictures toward the farmhouse, where his young niece, Ellie, was visiting for the week. That changed everything. Luke vaulted the fence and crossed the field with the kind of deliberate, predatory calm that made grown men reconsider their life choices. The investigator, a wiry man in a cheap jacket, stood up quickly, holding up his hands like a teenager caught shoplifting. "This is public land," the man stammered. Luke's voice was low and cold. "This is private ranch land. You're trespassing. And if you so much as take another picture, you're going to find out just how serious Montana takes trespassers." The man bolted for his car. That night, Luke sat on his porch, a mug of black coffee warming his hands, and decided enough was enough. It was time to end this, not by playing defense, but by striking back. First, he called Sheriff Caldwell and filed an official report about stalking, harassment, and unlawful surveillance. The sheriff, still fuming from the absurd number of complaints Karen had been filing over the past few months, promised swift action. Then, Luke called his lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Danielle Price, who had built a career defending ranchers from predatory developers. Within 24 hours, Danielle had drafted a formal cease and desist order against the Willowbrook HOA, citing harassment, attempted land theft, and defamation. And Luke wasn't going to stop at paperwork. He gathered his evidence, photographs, videos from his security cameras, copies of every ridiculous violation notice Karen had ever sent. He compiled it all into a thick binder he titled The Karen Chronicles. And with that, he walked straight into enemy territory. The Willowbrook HOA held their monthly board meeting in a sterile beige community center at the heart of the subdivision, a soulless building surrounded by manicured lawns and identical townhouses. Luke hadn't been inside before. He didn't need to. He could feel the HOA's sterile, suffocating spirit oozing from the place like swamp gas. When he pushed open the doors, the room fell silent. Dozens of homeowners turned to stare at him, mouths slightly open. There he stood tall, sun-scorched, boots dusty, wearing a denim jacket and a grim expression that said he didn't come here to negotiate. At the front of the room, perched like a vulture behind a plastic folding table, sat Karen Davenport. Clipboard clutched in white-knuckled fists. Her face drained of color when she saw him. Luke said nothing at first. He simply walked to the front, laid the Karen Chronicles on the table with a heavy thud, and crossed his arms. "You've crossed every line," he said, his voice low but carrying easily in the stunned quiet. "You've harassed me, trespassed on my land, endangered my family. I have it all documented." Karen sputtered, trying to regain the room. "This man, he's not even a member of this community. He has no standing here." But Luke only smiled slightly. He turned to the gathered homeowners, the same people Karen had ruled with iron-fisted pettiness for years. "I may not live behind your fences," he said, sweeping the room with his gaze. "But I've been your neighbor longer than Willowbrook even existed. I've been here through droughts, floods, fires. I watched this land grow. And I'm telling you right now, your HOA is being dragged into a legal battle because one person can't respect the limits of her authority." He let the words hang there. Then, calmly, he pulled out copies of the cease and desist notice and handed them directly to the HOA president, a grizzled man named Ronald Tate who looked more exhausted than angry. "You have two choices," Luke continued. "Rein Karen in, or watch your HOA get torn apart in court." For a moment, no one moved. Then, Ronald Tate spoke. "We'll need to discuss this," he said gruffly. "In executive session." Which, Luke knew, was HOA speak for, "We just realized we're screwed." He nodded once, tipped his hat, and walked out, leaving Karen gaping behind him, trapped, exposed. That night, Luke received a series of texts from Grace and Linda, his moles inside Willowbrook, telling him the board had gone into full panic mode. Some of them wanted to cut Karen loose immediately to save face. Others demanded an internal investigation. Rumors flew. Allegiances shifted. The monolith Karen had built out of fear and petty fines was cracking at the foundation. The next day, it crumbled completely. A formal email went out from the HOA board. Karen Davenport was suspended indefinitely pending investigation. The Willowbrook HOA would no longer pursue any action against Harrison Ranch. All previous complaints were being withdrawn. It was a total rout. Karen, stripped of her position, responded exactly as Luke expected, with a scorched earth meltdown. She tried to rally supporters, but even her staunchest allies abandoned her. She filed appeals that were ignored. She threatened lawsuits that never materialized. In the end, her tantrum only hastened her exile. Within a month, Karen Davenport's house hit the market, listed quietly through a desperate realtor trying to unload the property before her infamy could depress values further. Luke didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't need to. Every time he stood on his porch and looked across the open fields at Willowbrook, he knew he had won, not just for himself, but for every farmer, rancher, and independent soul who'd ever been told they didn't fit someone else's idea of perfection. And as he leaned back in his chair, the autumn wind carrying the scent of harvested wheat across the fields, Luke Harrison smiled and muttered to himself, "Let freedom ring." Then, with a mighty tug, he rang the bell again, its deep, booming note echoing across the valley, across Willowbrook, and into the hearts of everyone who had ever dared to stand their ground against petty tyranny. And somewhere, deep inside her beige, silent house, Karen Davenport flinched at the sound. It was over. Or so Luke thought. The signs appeared overnight. At first, Luke Harrison thought he was imagining it. The old country road leading to Harrison Ranch had always been a public right-of-way, a dusty, rutted stretch of gravel that connected several properties before disappearing into the hills. It had never been gated, never been marked private, because it wasn't. But now, bright white, private road. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted, signs lined either side of the road like sentries, their bold black letters glinting in the morning sun. They were staked deep into the ditches, hammered into posts that had been cemented overnight. Luke pulled his truck over and stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel. He ran his calloused fingers along one of the signs, noting the crispness of the paint, the fresh set of footprints in the dirt. And he smiled. A slow, dangerous smile. Karen Davenport was making one last desperate play. It didn't matter that she'd been stripped of her HOA presidency. It didn't matter that she was days away from moving trucks, pulling up to haul away her miserable collection of beige furniture. Somewhere deep in that bitter heart of hers, she had decided she wasn't leaving without leaving a scar behind. Luke didn't bother calling anyone right away. He simply drove back to the ranch, grabbed his Nikon camera, and took dozens of photos. Every sign, every fresh post, every inch of evidence. Then he drove straight to the county recorder's office. The clerk on duty, an older woman named Barb who had known Luke since he was a boy, adjusted her glasses and squinted at the photos. "These ain't legal," she said flatly. "Didn't think so," Luke replied. Barb pulled up the county records, tapping the keyboard with sharp clacks. "That road's public easement. Always has been. No HOA, no private citizen can claim it without a county hearing, and we haven't had one." Luke leaned on the counter. "Then what happens to the signs?" Barb grinned, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You let me make a few calls." By the time Luke got back to his ranch, the cavalry was already on its way. A county road crew rolled up around noon. 3 trucks, a backhoe, and a lot of very enthusiastic workers. Sheriff Tom Caldwell showed up too, leaning against his cruiser with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, watching the proceedings with undisguised amusement. "Looks like someone's gonna have a real bad afternoon," the sheriff drawled. One by one, the road workers tore out the illegal signs, tossing them into a growing heap like trophies of a petty war. Luke stayed out of the way, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold with quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to lift a finger. Karen came screeching down the road around 1 p.m., her SUV kicking up a rooster tail of dust, her face a mask of rage. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, leaping out of her vehicle. Tom Caldwell strolled over, tipping his hat casually. "Afternoon, Miss Davenport. You can't just remove private property," she spat. Tom's smile widened. "Funny thing about that. This here's county land. Always has been. These signs." He nudged the pile with the toe of his boot. "Illegal as a $3 bill." Karen's mouth flapped soundlessly for a moment before she jabbed a finger toward Luke, who stood nearby, utterly unbothered. "This is his fault. He's the one ruining everything." Tom arched an eyebrow. "Ma'am, the only thing Mr. Harrison ruined was your illusion of authority." Luke suppressed a chuckle. Karen, realizing she was utterly defeated, tried a different tactic. She produced a crumpled sheet of paper from her purse and shoved it toward Tom. "It's a petition," she said, voice shaking. "Several Willowbrook residents have signed it. They agree the road should be private." Tom unfolded the paper slowly, skimming the signatures. "Well, that's real cute," he said finally. But petitions don't override county law. You want this road private? You'll have to go through the county commission, public hearings, land surveys, thousands in fees. And from the looks of it, he tapped the worn gravel road with the heel of his boot. You don't have a prayer. Karen let out a strangled noise, half scream, half sob, before storming back to her car. She slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows, threw the SUV into gear, and tore off back toward Willowbrook. Luke watched her go, the corners of his mouth tugging into a slow, deep grin. It was over. Really, truly over. That night, as the stars burned cold and clear over Montana, Luke celebrated the only way he knew how, with a bonfire so massive it lit up the valley. Friends and neighbors gathered, sharing whiskey, laughter, and tall tales. The illegal private road signs were ceremonially thrown into the flames, sending showers of sparks spiraling into the darkness. As the fire roared, someone brought out an old guitar. Songs filled the air, songs about stubborn farmers, about standing your ground, about the kind of freedom that couldn't be bought or bulldozed. And above it all, from the hilltop, the great bronze bell rang out, a thunderous, joyous sound that rolled across Willowbrook, shaking the windows of empty houses soon to be listed for sale, rattling the nerves of anyone still clinging to the old order. Luke sat on the bed of his pickup, a mug of black coffee in hand, and smiled as the fire crackled and the bell sang. He didn't need courtrooms or lawyers to win. All he had needed was patience, and faith that truth, eventually, was louder than any Karen. In the months that followed Karen Davenport's humiliating downfall, Harrison Ranch didn't just survive, it thrived. The Montana Harvest Festival had been only the beginning. With Karen out of the picture, Luke found himself at the center of a community that had, for too long, been stifled by fear and conformity. People wanted more. And Luke, for the first time in his life, realized he wanted to give it to them. It started simply enough. The farmers' market he had launched on a whim became a permanent fixture, operating every Saturday and drawing visitors from towns miles away. Local artisans set up booths, selling everything from handcrafted furniture to wildflower honey. Young musicians performed on makeshift stages made from old hay wagons. Children roamed freely, chasing goats and giggling as they rolled down grassy hills. Then came the next big idea. Harvest Hollow, a fall festival so grand that even the State Tourism Board took notice. Luke transformed the ranch into a seasonal wonderland. A corn maze stretching across 20 acres. A giant pumpkin patch where families could pick their own gourds. Bonfires at night, with storytelling and esmores. Wagon rides under the stars, the big bronze bell tolling every hour to guide guests home. People came by the hundreds, then by the thousands. They came to buy produce, to dance in the fields, to breathe the kind of air you couldn't bottle and sell in a city. They came to feel alive again, to remember what it was like before everything got paved over and fenced in. And every single one of them passed by Luke's handmade sign at the entrance. Welcome to Harrison Ranch, proudly HOA-free since 1887. It became a symbol, a quiet, stubborn middle finger to the creeping spread of suburban soullessness. As Luke's world expanded, Karen's world shrank. Word trickled back to the ranch like wind carrying the scent of rain. Karen had sold her Willowbrook house in a fire sale, barely breaking even. She had moved to a new development 2 counties over, Pleasant Glen Estates, a place even more rigid and rule-obsessed than Willowbrook had ever been. At first, she tried to climb the social ladder there too. She attended board meetings, volunteered for committees, even hosted a few painfully dull neighborhood mixers. But it didn't take long for her reputation to catch up. Pleasant Glen had its own Karens, battle-hardened, deeply entrenched bureaucrats who saw any newcomer with ambition as a threat. They froze her out. They slapped her with petty fines. Brass 1 inch too high. Halloween decorations installed 2 days early. A wreath on her door deemed non-compliant with seasonal color guidelines. Karen tried to fight back, but without the power she once wielded, she was just another voice in the void, and not a particularly welcome one. The final insult came when someone, no one ever admitted, who secretly registered her on the town's unofficial social media group under the nickname HOA Karen. The name stuck. Forever branded, she became a pariah. The woman who once ruled a neighborhood now spent her days arguing with online moderators about yard gnome regulations and repainting her mailbox every other month to avoid citations. It was, Luke thought, a far more fitting punishment than any lawsuit could have delivered. Meanwhile, Harrison Ranch was booming. Local news stations ran features about the miracle of Harrison Ranch, highlighting its revival and the way it had brought communities together across county lines. People started traveling from out of state just to visit the festivals. Teachers brought students on field trips to learn about real farming life. Couples booked wedding venues under the open Montana sky. Luke even caught the attention of an independent documentary filmmaker who wanted to chronicle the fight against HOA overreach, using Luke's story as the centerpiece. Through it all, Luke remained steady. He built new barns, expanded his cattle herds, hosted barn dances in the summer and sledding parties in the winter. The ranch thrummed with life, love, and laughter. And every evening, just before sunset, Luke would walk up the grassy hill behind the main house, where the giant bronze bell stood silent and proud. He would grip the thick hemp rope, look out across the fields, sunflowers swaying, children laughing, farmers haggling good-naturedly, and he would give the rope a single, solemn pull. The bell would toll, deep, triumphant, unbroken. The sound would roll across the valley, past the roads that once bore illegal signs, past the neighborhoods that once turned their noses up at the dust of honest work, past the petty tyrants who thought they could control the land by passing rules and wielding clipboards. It would roll all the way into the heart of Willowbrook, where new families now lived without fear of fines, where kids left chalk drawings on sidewalks without punishment, where nobody cared if a rooster crowed at dawn. And somewhere, maybe in some cold, sterile house in Pleasant Glen Estates, a bitter woman would hear the echo of that bell and remember everything she lost. Luke didn't hate her. He didn't wish her harm. He simply forgot about her, the way a man forgets about a storm after the sun breaks through, a memory dulled by warmth and laughter and the stubborn, unstoppable rhythm of life. Because the truth was simple. Luke had won. Not by fighting harder, not by yelling louder, not by sinking to Karen's level. He had won by standing firm, by refusing to bow, by building something so vibrant, so undeniable, that even the most rigid hearts couldn't help but be moved. Freedom wasn't something you demanded. It was something you lived. And at Harrison Ranch, under the wide Montana sky, freedom rang out loud and clear every single day.